2,000 years later, 6.5 hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m., 3 weeks later, many months later, so much later that one old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one. Tomorrow for sure, eventually. 12 midnight, 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later.
You crying about it, and later A's will angry about that plan. Stand by. Give sorry to hear that.
Meanwhile, 2 hours later, A1K. The next day, later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later, 70 years later. Meanwhile, 6 hours later, later that same evening, several days later, 6 months later, 2 hours later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 1 minute 37 seconds later, 1 debt to society later, set 1 pair of pants later, say 8 hours later, 298 frozen patties later, 3 hours later, apology the next day. Meanwhile, if you want Squidward templates and friends worry about it now later, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later, 3 days later, opening night, later, 3,000 years later, 1 week later, 7:59 a.m., 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later, the following Thursdays.
5 minutes later,
24 hours later.
Much later, 7 hours later, apology. Several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later. 3 hours later, 1 minor later, the following day. Meanwhile, later, just then, brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the Lowlands. 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, in the void. Approximately 10 hours later, early the next mornings. 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later. A lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long, angry line later, 20 years later, 72 hours later, just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, 242 explosions later, montage, the next mornings. Many tic-tacs later, flashback, end of flashback, the next evening, 1 hour later, the next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later, the next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later, graduation day, 1 hour later, 5 minutes later, 80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
3,000 what posts later, soon after, later, moments later, the next morning, the unbearable hours later, 82 kilometers later, a little later, 1 season later, 4,373 moments later, 1 nap later, 6 months later, the next morning, the next date, 6 months later. Meanwhile, a few minutes later. 1 hour later,
5 billion years later.
the next morning, later, 1 million dillion, cotillion times later. Meanwhile, see next morning. The next Christmas, 1 enter later. Following 4 o'clock is very nice morning. 10 hours, 80 minutes later, 1 week later, that evening, later, the next morning, several days later, much later, 1 week later, 1 beautiful Christmas morning later, many version later, 1 week later, many meeks later, many plays later, many superstitions later, many buckets later, 14 hours later, days later. Meanwhile, the next morning, one nap later, 24 sleepless later. Several days later, one journey through space later, much tranquility later, 1 hour later, many hours later, a few moments later, the next day, one a while later, many miles later, the next day, 1 week later, the next morning, many hours later, 6 stinky months later, several weeks later, later that night, Avreka later,